There exists within the psyche of every empath a battlefield that no eye can see, no hand can touch, yet it rages with an intensity that would make the wars of nations seem like children's games. This is not the battle you think you know, not the struggle against absorbing others' pain or the exhaustion from feeling too much. No, this is deeper, more primal, more dangerous. This is the war between the empath and their own shadow, and most who wage it do not even know they are fighting. When I speak of shadow, I do not speak metaphorically. The shadow is not a poetic concept or spiritual abstraction. It is a living, breathing entity within the psyche, composed of everything the conscious mind has rejected, repressed, or refused to acknowledge about itself. For most people, the shadow remains comfortably hidden, projected onto others, blamed on circumstances, dismissed as temporary madness. But for the empath, the shadow becomes a relentless adversary, precisely because the empath's gift makes denial nearly impossible. You see, empathy is not merely the ability to feel what others feel. True empathy is the capacity to perceive the totality of human experience, including those aspects that civilization has deemed unacceptable. The empath does not simply absorb joy and sorrow. They absorb rage, perversion, violence, greed, the entire spectrum of human darkness. And here lies the terrible irony. The more sensitive one becomes to the shadow material of others, the more one must confront the shadow material within oneself. The battle begins in childhood, though few recognize it as such. The empathic child, overwhelmed by the emotional chaos around them, learns to split themselves in two. One half becomes the angel, the pure, caring, selfless being who exists to soothe and heal. The other half, the shadow, becomes the repository for every unacceptable impulse, every selfish desire, every moment of rage or cruelty that the angelic self cannot allow. This split is not conscious. The child does not decide to create this division. It happens as naturally as breathing, a survival mechanism in a world that rewards goodness and punishes authenticity. The angelic self learns to smile when it wants to scream, to give when it wants to take, to forgive when it wants to destroy. Meanwhile, the shadow grows stronger, fed by every denied impulse, every suppressed truth, every moment of self-betrayal. I have encountered many empaths in my clinical work, and without exception, they arrive at my door exhausted, not merely from feeling others' emotions, but from the constant effort of maintaining their angelic facade while battling their shadow in the darkness of their unconscious. They speak of feeling like frauds, of harboring secret thoughts that horrify them, of impulses that seem to contradict everything they believe themselves to be. One patient, a healer by profession, came to me tormented by violent fantasies. She could not understand how someone who dedicated her life to helping others could harbor such darkness. In her dreams, she wielded knives, set fires, committed acts of cruelty that made her wake in terror. She believed herself to be going mad, but I recognized the symptoms immediately. Her shadow, denied and repressed for decades, was demanding recognition. The empath's shadow is particularly dangerous because it carries not only personal material, but collective shadow as well. Through their porous boundaries, empaths absorb not just individual darkness, but the accumulated shadow of families, communities, entire cultures. They become unwitting vessels for humanity's disowned rage, its unacknowledged cruelty, its hidden perversions, and all of this material must go somewhere. When it cannot be processed consciously, it feeds the shadow. This is why empaths often find themselves in relationships with individuals who embody their disowned darkness. The unconscious seeks balance, and if the empath refuses to acknowledge their shadow, they will inevitably attract it in external form. The gentle empath marries the narcissist. The pacifist empath befriends the manipulator. The selfless empath enables the sociopath. They tell themselves they are helping, healing, bringing light to darkness, but they are actually engaging in shadow projection, using others as containers for their own disowned material. The battle intensifies as the empath ages and the shadow grows stronger. What begins as occasional dark thoughts evolves into persistent fantasies. The empath who once felt guilty for a moment of anger now finds themselves consumed by rage they cannot express. The empath who prided themselves on their compassion discovers wells of cruelty within themselves that terrify them. They may begin to act out in subtle ways: passive aggression, emotional manipulation, spiritual superiority, all while maintaining their identity as the good one, the helper, the light worker. But the shadow cannot be contained forever. It will find expression, and often in ways that destroy the very relationships and reputation the empath has worked so hard to protect. The gentle healer becomes the harsh critic. The compassionate friend becomes the bitter judge. The selfless parent becomes the controlling tyrant. And still, the empath refuses to recognize these behaviors as emanating from their own shadow, instead blaming circumstances, stress, or the darkness of others. The most insidious aspect of this battle is that the empath's very gift becomes weaponized against them. Their ability to perceive shadow material makes them exquisitely sensitive to their own darkness, but their identification with their angelic self makes integration impossible. They can feel their shadow storing, but cannot claim it as their own. They can sense their darkness rising, but cannot allow it expression. They live in a constant state of internal warfare, using their empathic abilities to police their own psyche, suppressing every impulse that threatens their idealized self-image. This internal policing creates what I call the empathic prison, a psychological construct where the individual becomes both warden and prisoner. The angelic self stands guard, monitoring every thought, every feeling, every impulse for signs of shadow contamination. When darkness is detected, it is immediately suppressed, denied, projected outward onto safer targets. The shadow self, meanwhile, grows increasingly desperate for recognition, becoming more extreme, more violent, more perverse in its attempts to break through the conscious barriers. The tragedy is that this battle is entirely unnecessary. The shadow is not the enemy. It is the source of power, creativity, and authentic vitality. Within the shadow lie not only destructive impulses, but also repressed gifts, disowned strengths, and vital life force that has been deemed unacceptable by the conscious mind. The empath's shadow contains their capacity for healthy selfishness, their ability to set boundaries, their right to feel anger, their permission to prioritize their own needs. But integration requires courage that few empaths possess. It means acknowledging that the pure, selfless being they believe themselves to be is a fiction. It means accepting that they are capable of cruelty, selfishness, manipulation, and destruction. It means embracing the totality of their humanity, including those aspects that contradict their spiritual self-image. The path of shadow integration begins with recognition. The empath must learn to identify their shadow projections, to recognize when they are using others as containers for their own disowned darkness. They must examine their relationships and ask the uncomfortable question: what aspect of myself am I seeing reflected in this person? The narcissist they are trying to heal may represent their own disowned grandiosity. The manipulator they are trying to fix may embody their own denied need for control. Dreams become particularly important in this process, as the unconscious often uses dream imagery to communicate shadow material. The empath must learn to pay attention to the villains in their dreams, to the dark figures that pursue them, to the violent scenarios that terrify them upon waking. These are not random nightmare, but communications from the shadow, attempts to bring disowned material to consciousness. Active imagination, a technique I developed, becomes crucial for shadow dialogue. The empath must learn to engage with their shadow directly, to give it voice, to allow it to express its needs and desires without judgment. This is not about acting out shadow impulses, but about acknowledging their existence and finding healthy ways to honor their underlying needs. The process is frightening because it threatens the empath's core identity. They have built their entire sense of self around being good, pure, helpful, light-filled. To acknowledge their shadow feels like psychological suicide. But this death of the false self is necessary for true individuation to occur. Only by accepting their totality can the empath become truly whole. Integration does not mean becoming cruel or selfish. It means becoming honest about one's capacity for cruelty and selfishness while choosing not to act from those impulses unconsciously. The integrated empath can feel their anger without being consumed by it. They can acknowledge their selfish desires without being enslaved by them. They can recognize their capacity for manipulation without using it to control others. Most importantly, shadow integration allows the empath to develop genuine compassion rather than the codependent sympathy that characterizes their pre-integration state. When they accept their own darkness, they can witness the darkness in others without needing to fix it, change it, or absorb it. They can offer presence without losing themselves, support without enabling, love without fusion. The battle within the empath is ultimately a battle for wholeness, for the right to exist as a complete human being rather than a fragmented angel. It is a battle that must be fought in the depths of the psyche, in the realm of dreams and symbols and buried memories. It is a battle that can only be won through surrender to the truth of one's complete nature, including those aspects that the conscious mind finds unacceptable. This surrender is not defeat, but liberation. When the empath stops fighting their shadow and begins to dance with it, the internal warfare ends. The energy that was once consumed by repression becomes available for creative expression, authentic relationship, and genuine service to others. The empath discovers that they are not less powerful when they acknowledge their darkness. They are infinitely more powerful. The shadow, when integrated, becomes the source of the empath's greatest strength. It provides the backbone needed to set boundaries, the fire needed to protect the innocent, the sword needed to cut through illusion. The integrated empath becomes a warrior of light, not because they have eliminated darkness, but because they have learned to wield it consciously. But this integration is not a one-time event. It is a lifelong process. The shadow continues to evolve, continues to present new material for integration. The empath must remain vigilant, not to suppress their darkness, but to recognize when new shadow material is emerging and needs attention. They must develop what I call shadow literacy, the ability to read the signs of shadow activation and respond with consciousness rather than repression. This ongoing relationship with the shadow transforms the empath's entire approach to life. They no longer see themselves as pure beings contaminated by a dark world. Instead, they recognize themselves as complete beings navigating a complex reality that contains both light and shadow. They stop trying to heal others' darkness and start focusing on integrating their own. They stop seeking perfection and start pursuing wholeness. The silent battle within empaths is ultimately the battle for authentic selfhood.
It is the struggle between the false self that seeks approval through perfection and the true self that embraces totality. It is the conflict between the persona that masks reality and the individual who dares to live truthfully. For the empath who has the courage to face this battle consciously, who dares to embrace their shadow rather than fight it, the reward is nothing less than the reclamation of their full humanity and the discovery of their true power. But know this, the battle never truly ends. It only transforms from unconscious warfare to conscious partnership. The integrated empath learns to live with their shadow as an ally rather than an enemy, to dance with their darkness rather than deny it, to find in their totality the wholeness that no amount of angelic striving could ever provide. There is a particular phenomenon I have observed in empaths who begin this journey of shadow integration, what I call the dark night of the empath's soul. This is a period, often lasting months or years, where the carefully constructed identity begins to crumble. The empath who once prided themselves on their kindness discovers wells of cruelty within. The one who believed themselves incapable of selfishness finds themselves consumed by narcissistic impulses. The individual who saw themselves as a healer realizes they have been manipulating others through their very compassion. This period is terrifying because it threatens everything the empath thought they knew about themselves. They may experience what appears to be a complete personality reversal. The gentle soul becomes harsh and critical. The generous giver becomes stingy and withholding. The patient listener becomes impatient and dismissive. Family members and friends may express shock at these changes, further destabilizing the empath's sense of identity. But this dark night is not pathology, it is initiation. The shadow, having been denied for so long, must have its moment in the sun. Like a prisoner finally released after years of solitary confinement, it emerges with a vengeance, expressing all the impulses that have been suppressed. This is a necessary part of the integration process, though few empaths understand this when they are living through it. I recall a patient, a woman in her 40s, who had spent her entire adult life as what she called a people pleaser. She came to me in crisis because she had begun experiencing what she described as evil thoughts. She would imagine telling her demanding mother exactly what she thought of her, fantasize about abandoning her needy friends, dream of scenarios where she caused others pain. She was convinced she was becoming a monster.
But as we worked together, it became clear that these were not evil thoughts. They were her shadow's attempts to communicate. Her mother had indeed been emotionally abusive, and her anger was completely justified. Her friends had indeed been using her, and her desire to withdraw was a healthy impulse towards self-preservation. Her fantasies of causing pain were symbolic expressions of her need to stop absorbing others' pain. The challenge for empaths during this dark night is to neither suppress the shadow nor be overwhelmed by it. They must learn what I call conscious containment, the ability to hold paradox without collapsing into either extreme. They must acknowledge their capacity for cruelty without becoming cruel, recognize their selfish impulses without becoming selfish, feel their anger without becoming consumed by rage. This requires developing what I term the observing ego, a part of the psyche that can witness both light and shadow without identifying completely with either. The observing ego allows the empath to say, I notice I am feeling murderous rage toward this person, and I acknowledge this rage as part of my human experience, but I choose not to act from this place. This is vastly different from the pre-integration stance of, I should not feel this rage, therefore I will pretend it does not exist. Dreams during this period become particularly intense and revealing.
The empath may find themselves dreaming of committing violent acts, engaging in sexual perversions, or behaving in ways that horrify their waking consciousness. These dreams are not predictions or desires. They are the psyche's attempts to balance the excessive identification with goodness. The unconscious presents these shadow scenarios to force conscious recognition of disowned material. One patient dreamed repeatedly of torturing small animals, an image that filled her with such revulsion she could barely speak of it. But when we explored the dream symbolically, it became clear that the small animals represented the vulnerable, helpless parts of herself that she had been systematically destroying through self-neglect and self-criticism. The torturer in the dream was her own internalized cruelty, finally becoming visible so it could be addressed. The integration process also reveals the ways in which empaths have been unconsciously manipulative. This is perhaps the most difficult recognition for many, as it directly contradicts their self-image as selfless givers. But the truth is that many empaths use their sensitivity as a form of control. They give not from genuine generosity, but to create obligation. They help not from pure compassion, but to feel superior. They absorb others' pain not from authentic empathy, but to feel needed and important. This unconscious manipulation often takes the form of what I call emotional martyrdom. The empath suffers visibly and dramatically, ensuring that others feel guilty for their role in causing or failing to alleviate this suffering. They may not consciously intend this manipulation, but the shadow uses their empathic abilities to control others through guilt, pity, and obligation. Recognition of these shadow patterns is deeply humbling. The empath must confront the reality that they are not the pure, selfless being they believe themselves to be. They must acknowledge that their very gift has been contaminated by shadow motivations. This recognition often precipitates a crisis of meaning. If they are not who they thought they were, then who are they? If their empathy is not pure, then what value does it have? This crisis, while painful, is necessary for true individuation. The empath must die to their false identity in order to be reborn as a whole human being. They must release their attachment to being good in order to discover what it means to be real. They must surrender their role as savior in order to find their authentic purpose. The death of the empathic persona often manifests as a period of apparent callousness. The empath who once couldn't bear to see others suffer may suddenly find themselves unmoved by displays of pain they would have previously rushed to heal. The individual who once absorbed every emotion in a room may discover they can witness others' distress without feeling compelled to fix it. This is not cruelty, it is the emergence of healthy boundaries. During this phase, empaths often report feeling guilty about their apparent lack of feeling. They worry they have become cold, unfeeling, even sociopathic. But this emotional withdrawal is actually a necessary part of the healing process. The empathic system, exhausted from years of overextension, must rest and recalibrate. Like a broken bone that must be immobilized to heal properly, the empathic capacity must sometimes go offline temporarily to restore its proper function. The shadow integration process also reveals the extent to which empaths have been living in service to others' shadows. Many empaths unconsciously take on the role of the family scapegoat, absorbing and expressing the disowned darkness of the family system. They become the identified patient, the problem child, the one who acts out while others maintain their facade of normality. This scapegoating often begins in early childhood. The empathic child, unable to process the emotional chaos around them, begins to internalize and express the family's shadow material. They may become the angry one in a family that prides itself on being peaceful, the sad one in a family that demands perpetual optimism, the crazy one in a family that insists on rationality. The family unconsciously colludes in this arrangement because it allows them to maintain their preferred identity by projecting their disowned aspects onto the empathic member. Breaking free from this scapegoating role requires tremendous courage. The empath must be willing to hand back the shadow material that never belonged to them in the first place. They must stop being the family's emotional garbage disposal and start insisting that others take responsibility for their own psychological waste. This often precipitates family crises, as other members are forced to confront their own shadow material without their usual scapegoat to carry it for them. The process of shadow reclamation also involves what I call genealogical shadow work, tracing the inherited patterns of repression and projection that have been passed down through family lines. Empaths often carry not only their own shadow material, but ancestral shadow as well. They may find themselves expressing anger that belongs to a silenced grandmother, grief that belongs to a traumatized grandfather, or shame that belongs to generations of family secrets. This ancestral shadow material can be particularly confusing because it does not seem to relate to the empath's personal experience. They may find themselves consumed by rage over injustices they never personally suffered, or paralyzed by shame over actions they never committed. Understanding the genealogical dimension of shadow work allows empaths to begin the process of returning this material to its proper owners, whether through family confrontations, ritualistic releases, or symbolic acknowledgments.
The integration of ancestral shadow often requires the empath to become the one who speaks the unspeakable truths of the family lineage. They must be willing to name the secrets, confront the denials, and refuse to carry the shame that rightfully belongs to previous generations. This is sacred work, but it often comes at the cost of family acceptance and belonging. As the shadow integration process deepens, empaths begin to discover what lies beneath their compulsive helping behaviors. Many realize that their drive to heal others stems not from pure compassion, but from a deep fear of abandonment. They help not because others need help, but because they need to feel needed. They heal not because healing is their calling, but because being indispensable feels safer than being authentic. This recognition leads to what I call the Great Withdrawal, a period where the empath steps back from their habitual role as helper and healer. They may stop volunteering for causes they once championed, withdraw from friends who only contact them when in crisis, and refuse family members' attempts to cast them in their familiar role as problem solver. This withdrawal is not permanent, but it is necessary for the empath to discover who they are when they are not defined by their usefulness to others. During this withdrawal, empaths often experience profound loneliness. They realize that many of their relationships were based on their function rather than their authentic self. People who once sought their company for comfort and guidance may drift away when these services are no longer available. This loss is painful but illuminating. It reveals which relationships were genuine and which were merely transactional. The shadow integration process also demands that empaths confront their own victim consciousness. Many empaths have become addicted to suffering, finding in their pain a sense of identity, purpose, and even superiority. They may unconsciously seek out situations that confirm their role as the wounded healer, the misunderstood sensitive, the one who suffers for others' sins. This victim identity must be surrendered if true healing is to occur. Releasing victim consciousness requires empaths to acknowledge their own participation in their suffering. They must recognize the ways in which they have chosen martyrdom over empowerment, complaint over action, suffering over healing. This is not about self-blame, but about reclaiming personal power. As long as empaths see themselves primarily as victims of their sensitivity, they remain powerless to transform their experience. The process of shadow integration fundamentally alters the empath's relationship to their gift. Pre-integration, empathy feels like a burden, a curse, something that happens to them. Post-integration, empathy becomes a skill, a choice, something they consciously direct. They learn to turn their empathic sensitivity on and off like a radio, tuning in when appropriate and shutting out when necessary. This mastery over their empathic abilities allows integrated empaths to engage with others' pain without being consumed by it. They can witness suffering without absorbing it, offer support without enabling dependency, and provide healing without depleting themselves. Their empathy becomes precise and intentional, rather than indiscriminate and unconscious. The integrated empath also develops what I call shadow empathy, the ability to perceive and understand others' darkness without being contaminated by it. They can recognize manipulation without being manipulated, witness cruelty without becoming cruel, and see through deception without becoming cynical. This shadow empathy becomes a powerful tool for navigation in a world that often masks its true intentions. Perhaps most importantly, shadow integration allows empaths to develop genuine self-compassion. Pre-integration empaths often show endless compassion for others while being mercilessly self-critical. They can forgive others' flaws while condemning themselves for the smallest imperfections. Shadow integration reveals the cruelty of this double standard and allows empaths to extend to themselves the same kindness they so freely offer others. This self-compassion is not self-indulgence, but recognition of shared humanity. The empath realizes that they are subject to the same psychological forces as everyone else, that they are neither saint nor sinner, but simply human. This recognition is simultaneously humbling and liberating. Humbling because it destroys grandiose self-concepts, liberating because it frees them from the impossible standard of perfection. The journey of shadow integration transforms empaths from wounded healers into whole human beings. They no longer need others to be broken in order to feel valuable. They no longer need to suffer in order to feel worthy. They no longer need to give endlessly in order to feel loved. Instead, they discover that their worth is inherent, their value is unconditional, and their love is most powerful when it includes themselves. This transformation ripples outward, affecting every relationship and interaction. The integrated empath becomes a mirror of wholeness rather than brokenness, reflecting back to others their potential for integration rather than their need for healing. They become beacons of possibility, living proof that sensitivity need not be a liability, that feeling deeply need not mean suffering endlessly, that empathy can be a source of strength rather than weakness. But the path of integration is not for the faint of heart. It requires the courage to face the darkest aspects of oneself, the willingness to abandon cherished identities, and the strength to stand alone while old relationships dissolve and new ones form. It demands nothing less than the death and rebirth of the self, a process that is always transformative but never comfortable. But for those who undertake this journey, who dare to embrace their shadow rather than fight it, the rewards are immeasurable. They discover within themselves reserves of strength they never knew existed. They find that their darkness, when owned rather than disowned, becomes a source of power and creativity. They learn that wholeness is not the absence of shadow, but the conscious integration of all aspects of self. The silent battle within empaths can only end one way, not with the victory of light over darkness, but with the marriage of opposites within the integrated psyche. When empaths stop warring with their shadow and start dancing with it, they discover the secret that mystics have always known, that darkness and light are not enemies, but partners in the eternal dance of becoming.
And in that dance lies the empath's ultimate destiny, not as wounded healer or suffering servant, but as whole human being, complete in their contradictions, powerful in their paradoxes, and finally, eternally at peace with the totality of who they are. This is the gift of shadow work, not the elimination of darkness, but the transformation of the relationship to darkness. And in that transformation lies the empath's ultimate liberation from the silent battle that once consumed their soul.